Hello and welcome to This Is Just Ross and Chris. We're talking about buy-to-let investment property, selling tenanted properties across the whole of Scotland. And this week, just a few days ago, in Scotland, the rent cap was removed. There is continued protection for tenants. That's the phrasing that's being used. And there are, of course, as there always has been, some rules and some guidelines around about the ability to increase the rent by landlords. And there's a process for tenants to follow. And again, there's guidelines as to what kind of increase, what level of increase landlords can make to rent. Obviously, we know the backdrop is that over the last, how long is it now, Ross? 3 years? 4? Few years.
4, because there was a rent. The rent got frozen, didn't it, for a period of time during COVID, and then there was a 3% rent cap. For the cost of living crisis.
So over that period of time, largely landlords have not been able to increase the rent, but market rents have gone kind of through the roof. Market rents are a lot higher than the rent that most landlords are receiving, and at the same time, the interest rates were going up. So, we speak to a lot of landlords that were really struggling with all of this. So thank goodness, and we probably have talked about this a lot already, but thank goodness the legislation is going back to more or less how it was, and I would say much more of a common sense approach. Although, having looked at some figures just now, Ross, and played around with this calculator that we're going to talk about, still quite restrictive in some ways. It just depends.
It is, yeah. I mean, people might think that they've replaced a 3% rent cap with a 12% rent cap, and in some cases that is the case. And it's probably important for us to say straight away that these measures are only in place if a tenant challenges the rent increase that a landlord proposes to them. But going back to the rent cap, and I know that we have discussed this before, but the rent cap impacted investment in the private rented sector, and it impacted landlords' ability to spend money on their properties, improve them, make them more energy efficient, and make them a better place for tenants to stay at. So it's good that it's been removed. And the Scottish Government said that this new bit of legislation allows landlords to reinvest in our private rented sector. So they're looking for this to encourage people to reinvest in the private rented sector. So that would be a good thing, obviously. But there's various things in here, and it's not one size fits all for every single tenant, every single property, every single rent. The good news is the calculator is online. It gives you some guidance over what the rent increase might be for your particular circumstances. You have to have a few things. You have to have the current rent, you have to have the proposed increased rent, and you have to know what you think the market rent might be for the particular property. So I don't know where we are, but ultimately, if a landlord wants to increase the rent now, there's no restriction. They can put the rent up to whatever they want to put the rent up. And most landlords are very reasonable. They might have a chat with the tenants before they increase the rent, say, I'm thinking about doing this. I just want it to go up to a reasonable amount after what's happened with the rent's been frozen in the 3% rent cap over the last few years. I need to put my costs up. And most tenants will be like, oh, okay, right, I can understand that. What is it going to be? And there could be a discussion about what works out for all parties. Now, that's a very sort of ideal world scenario that's not going to work for every single person. But I think in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think most tenants see what's happening. Most tenants appreciate the property that they're in and don't want to have to move out. And if they did, they'd be paying the market rent. So somewhere that's more than what they're paying just now, maybe something that's slightly below the market rent, and that may well be above this 12% that's talked about on the government legislation. But again, it's not necessarily an unfair rent increase, even though it's going to be above 12%. But that's really down to the tenant's interpretation of that.
Yeah, there's a big campaign by the Scottish Government at the moment to really raise awareness. We've noticed a lot of adverts online on social media just asking tenants to confront landlords if they think the rent increase is unfair. So I suppose as part of the legislation that's come out, there's some timescales that we now know about what could happen, when it could happen. So if a tenant, I think tenant has 21 days to report or challenge the rent increase that the landlord's given them.
Yeah.
And once that challenge has been put through to Rent Service Scotland or First Tier Tribunal, the Rent Service Scotland, it says on the website, will review and aim to get back to that tenant within 40 days. So that seems fairly ambitious, only on the basis that we think there might be a lot of rent increase notices issued this week.
Well, we know there are.
Yeah, but I suspect there'll be some stats maybe in a month's time to then
Yeah.
tell us about how many have come through in the first week and first month of the legislation changing.
But you're going back to what you said about this is okay. I'm going to paraphrase, but to save the Scottish private rented sector, it does kind of need saving because the Scottish government certainly have realised, maybe always knew, that the legislation that it introduced was just so damaging to housing, and the important role that the Scottish PRS has to Scottish housing. So, again, speaking to lots of landlords, they're very glad that we're at this stage. And a lot of rents will be going up, not unfairly. The example that we looked at, imagine a rent that's £500 per month. The market rent for that could now be 750. I mean, that depends when the tenant moved in at 500 and so on. But, even in the space of 4 years, that's the kind of rent increases, market rent increases that have happened. So anyway, you might want to put that, you wouldn't necessarily go from 500 straight up to sort of 750, but you might be looking up to around about 650 or something like that, 625, maybe more, maybe less. And the tenant could well be understanding of that because it's a big hike, but again, in the backdrop of how rents are now, doesn't seem so unfair. But 12% is actually only 560, so you could increase it by £60. And really, so it just depends on, again, the tenant's reaction to that. And it's the Rent Service Scotland, I think it's called. I think they're based in Dundee, not relevant necessarily, but there's there's a form that a tenant that fills out. You talked about it, Ross. You have to fill that in within about 21 days of the rent increase. The notice period to increase the rent is 3 months. So if a landlord's going to increase the rent, they'll be doing it this week, and then when we get to the beginning of July is when actually the rent increase would kick in.
Yeah, that's for a PRT. Most tenancies in Scotland probably are PRTs now, but yeah, for a PRT it's 3 months notice.
Yeah, and short assured tenancy, you could have increased the rent actually at any stage.
Yeah. Interestingly, on the form on the Scottish Government website, for the form that the tenants need to fill in to challenge the rent increase, the Scottish Government sort of give advice over what information they need to supply, and they've said you need to know your landlord details, you need to list the details of the tenants that are jointly on the tenancy agreement. You need to know details about your home, such as whether it has double glazing and whether there's any shared areas. That is a bit slightly strange that they've listed down whether it has double glazing, but I've not been through the whole form online, but
well, I'm looking at the form now. Okay. I have lost my glasses, as we've talked about, but I think I can read it okay. And I can't see anywhere where there's space to, add information about the property. But anyway, doesn't really matter so much. But it's interesting that that they are asking about energy efficiency stuff. But I can't see it on the form. It's a pretty straightforward form, simple form for a tenant to fill in. So we wanted obviously to talk about the process around and this calculator is really good. So we'll put a link somewhere underneath the video with a link to this calculator so you can play around with it. Obviously, tenants have got that as well. It's in a lot of the legislation and communication that tenants are getting. Check your calculator. Again, always interested to hear your thoughts, and if you are, whether or not you're increasing rent, what kind of reaction tenants you've had from tenants that you're dealing with. Is there anything else we need to say, Ross, or has that been informative enough?
I think it is. It'll be interesting to see how things sort of pan out, and if the Scottish Government are willing to release statistics about how many rent increase notices. Well, they wouldn't necessarily know. It would be the volume of challenges that they've handled
Yeah.
would be how much. So not necessarily know how many increased letters went out, notices went out this week from landlords, but they would know eventually how many challenges there've been from a tenant's perspective.
It would be quite good if there was a central database, and when you're increasing rent, you do it through this database or something, and then everything can be recorded. I'm not really that into Big Brother stuff. I'm quite into stats.
Well, one of the problems, and one of the critiques that the Scottish Government had over the last few years is they don't have much data.
No.
They don't have much stats. So any decisions they made is never based on stats or data that are seen. It's based on political ideology, is what I'm trying to say.
Easy for you to say.
Correct.
Yeah, you're right. Well, thanks a lot for watching and listening, and keep in touch. Let us know your thoughts, and good luck out there. Thanks. All the best.
Thanks.